Fill her up.
You're listening to the Gas Digital Network.
Good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. This is an episode that is going to be very geeky and intense because we have with us a very special guest, Elizabeth Spiers, who's one of the few people I can say that I am in awe of, who has been a very good friend to me, a bit of a role model in your career. Let me give people the background because you're not a household name, but you, being 80 pounds, punch so much above your weight in terms of changing the culture that it's insane. I first knew about you in 2003 because you were the founding editor of Gawker, and we came up when the blog scene was becoming a thing. I have very fond memories of it now. I'm sure you do as well. You basically are a one-woman media dynamo. You created, was it called Dealbreaker, which was the law blog. Then you were put on charge of Observer when Jared Kushner decided he wanted to be a newspaperman. I'm sure your list of credits is insane because what you did for a very long time is people wanted to launch. What was that fashion one you did?
Fashionista.com.
No, another one where it was curated clothes.
No, I don't think that was me.
No,
I did a company called Breaking Media that had Dealbreaker, Above the Law, and Fashionista. And they were all Wall Street blog, legal blog, and then a fashion industry blog.
There was one, and I'm positive you were involved in some capacity. I'm not completely crazy. It was basically like a way for indie designers to. I was at the party, and you were there. That's why I'm remembering this. I could be wrong. For herself or something like that, by yourself, whatever. It doesn't matter. Maybe I should have done my homework a little bit better. The point being, so much of what has come of our culture is because of you and people like us. You were the founding editor of Gawker. Mm-hmm. You worked with Jared Kushner. So in many ways, both cancel culture and Trump can be laid at your feet. So anything that's wrong in this country that people hate, whether political aisle, they can blame you. So which of those do you regret?
I think sometimes they blame me for stuff that I have nothing to do with anyway. So after 20 years of it, I'm kind of inured. It's like, go ahead. Blame me for whatever. It's fine.
So let's talk about working with Jared at The Observer. Because you are one of the very few people who worked... Here's the other thing. This is just a sidebar, but it's something that bears mentioning. I always tell people I judge people by how they treat me and whether they're a good friend and not by their politics. I think it's deranged to, if you're going to call someone you're having a trouble, to be like, wait, did they vote for the right person? You're an example of this. I don't even know where your politics are. You're probably pretty much to the left compared to me.
I'm a progressive, so I think I'm your unwitting diversity program here.
No, that's not true. I've had hard left people here on the show and commies, whatever. But the point being, it would never enter my head. You've been there for me during like a particularly dark time in my life. It would never enter my head to care what your politics are. Do you think that that's something let's talk about that for a bit. Is that something you think that's gotten worse in recent years, that the politicization of America, is that a thing, or is that just kind of a think piece?
Well, I think the problem is, we have a politics that's driven so heavily by negative partisanship now that it becomes divorced from any real discussion of, ideas that underlie policy. So, I'm from rural Alabama. My entire family is conservative. 99% of my relatives voted for Trump. And sometimes, that we would, I fight with them about politics routinely. We get into arguments. But I've never sort of felt like I could just draw a line and be like, I'm disowning them because And there are people who do feel that way. I don't know anybody who's come from my background who's actually gone out and done that. Like the people who are sort of like, well, if your family's that terrible, you should just never speak to them again, are always people who grow up with parents who have the same ideology they do. And that is still the biggest predictor of where you're going to land ideologically is wherever your parents are or where they were during your formative years. So I'm also a bit of an outlier in that I've sort of incrementally moved to the left over 20 years, and I grew up an evangelical conservative. So I'm a weirdo to begin with. So.
Explain to me and to the audience how someone who's been at the epicenter of New York corporate media has gotten more left because you're seeing how the sausage has been made, and you're seeing a lot of these people, by your own admission, I'm sure, are not good people, and that's the case in any system. You're going to have bad athletes, you're going to have bad lawyers, you're going to have bad doctors. So how has that kind of informed your perspective on our culture?
Well, I think I tend to take people and situations on a case-by-case basis. You know, whenever I talk to, for instance, my family members who did support Trump, you know, when you ask them why, the range of reasons is all over the place.
Yeah.
Like for my mother, she's a single-issue abortion voter. She's never not going to vote for a Republican. So she has no idea what Trump stands for or otherwise.
Right.
And she
That's all
doesn't
she
care.
needs to know. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there are other people who vote for him because they don't like immigrants and they're racist, and
Sure.
that's their entire raison d'etre, rationale for voting for Trump. So I try to have discussions with people about why they think the way that they do, and I work in politics now somewhat. We work with progressive candidates, and my business partner Peter is a pollster. It's our job to understand how people vote, why, what their reasons are, and how sometimes they'll justify things to themselves that aren't really supported by even an ideological rationale, or certainly not a policy rationale, because that's how most people vote. Most people are not super engaged in politics.
No.
So most people are generally apolitical, and it doesn't mean that, they live in an apolitical environment. It just means that they're not engaged the way that, those of us who live on Twitter 24/7 are. So.
When you started Gawker, it was very much, I would say, and please correct me if you think this is incorrect, in many ways it was closer like Time Out New York than it was a kind of a media piece, in that you weren't, you were, as you would phrase it, you're throwing spitballs at people. You're pointing out, hey, there's this cool event. This is a cool thing happening here. This person switched jobs. Yeah. It was media covering, but it seemed very familial. Yeah. And very positive and kind of like with a little dimple, but it was still, upbeat and earnest and fun and finding cool things that people might not be aware of. Gawker, hence the name. What do you think? I mean, when Corey took over after you, I think he still kind of had that to a large extent. I'm a huge Corey Seeka fan. But it seemed later to have taken a much nastier turn. Is that something that you saw coming? How did you feel about that? Do you think that's accurate?
Well, I think it's, there are pieces that Gawker did that were nastier. I'm not sure that institutionally it turned nastier, but what did happen is, every edition of Gawker was heavily shaped by whoever was the editor-in-chief at the time. Their personal interests, the tone they used. So, Jessica Cohen was a very different editor than A.J. Delario, to put it mildly. Yeah. And when Nick and I were doing it, and I was the only Gawker employee, Gawker contractor, technically, we used to have arguments over what the site would be. And Nick wanted it to be more service-oriented. So you could go on the site and learn the ins and outs of New York, or, where to find the best tailor in what neighborhood of New York, where the cool restaurants were. And I always push back on that because I, first of all, didn't know where the cool restaurants were and wasn't making enough money to eat at them anyway. Nick and I had a sort of, sometimes we were very close friends at the time, but I was barely paying my rent, and Nick was, eating at Balthazar 300
across the street. Yeah.
And so, we had some headbutting around issues like that. But I'd always loved Spy magazine.
Yeah.
And Private Eye. So I wanted something that was more in the vein of Spy, where you could sort of read between the lines that the site really loved New York as a city, and could dissect how it worked and how power worked in New York, but with wit. And with, a sense of fun to it. And another thing that happened with Gawker is that it just became more national in scope. It's sort of the scope of what it was trying to do became a lot more broader, and it became more celebrity-oriented, and it had more of a tabloidy feel. And in some ways, that was not a good thing. And in other ways, they hired people who certainly had better reporting skills than I had whenever we started Gawker. So they also broke a lot of stories. Sure. They were first to the Weinstein story. They published Jeffrey Epstein's Little Black Book. Adrian Chen did some great reporting around Guccifer and the email hacks. And those things would not have been possible when I was writing Gawker. I was writing 12 posts a day, 7 days a week. So none of them were going to be super substantive. So
let's talk a bit about The Observer, which you ran under Jared Kushner. Now, one of the, given my background and people I associate with, like I get a lot of anti-Trump heat sometimes on Twitter. And one of the things that people like to throw out is like, ha ha, Jared Kushner, whatever, blah, blah. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, I know all the Trump people. No one likes Jared in Trump world. Like,
I think that's true.
He's not like, they like Junior, right? Because Junior like has memes, but like Jared, everyone's just like, oh my God, this guy's the worst. Yeah. So is he the worst in real life?
I don't know. Like, I think he's worse. I certainly, my opinion changed of him. I would say my opinion was never great of him, but whenever I left The Observer in 2012, I wasn't angry at him. I didn't think, I thought he was a guy who cared about status to the exclusion of literally everything else. He was a social climber. He was not exactly the best boss I've ever worked for. But I don't remember I didn't really think he was a nihilist until he beelined to DC and started getting behind things that he would have, never supported before. He'd been a registered Democrat. He'd done fundraisers for Democratic candidates. And that was, slightly enraging. So, it's in terms of whether he's the worst, it's like, no, I think there are people in the administration who are worse. I think Stephen Miller's worse. I think the Trump sons, I always like to say, I don't think Eric is actually the dumbest one. And that's my most controversial Trump kid opinion. But Junior does this thing where he sort of cosplays being a redneck. And it works really well for the Trump base. Like, they buy it because they want to buy it. They want to believe that the Trumps are kind of like them in some way. And Jared could never do that. Like, even if he wanted to, it just wouldn't come across. Like, Junior can kind of be a little bit convincing about it. He'll put on the camo and go hunting, and Jared's just constitutionally incapable of doing that.
So what was that relationship like? Because you are someone who doesn't suffer fools gladly. Yeah. It's not like you have a temper, but like whatever. You're like, okay, listen, I can see through what you're trying to do. The fact that you accomplished what he would like to do, meaning you were nobody from Alabama, and then you became like, such a major player in New York media circles. That's the dream. Like, you came from this small town, whatever, or red state, and then you became a player, and you didn't have, this whole background where your dad got sent to jail by the guy who's advising your father-in-law to become president, and that got kind of awkward by setting up prostitution stuff, which I definitely think people should Google, because there's nothing funny and awkward there about Chris Christie and the Kushners. So it must be someone whose background was so much about like feet of clay and looking at these people, like, how can you, has every privilege imaginable, how can you aspire to try to be like these people?
Yeah. You mean Jared or?
Jared, yeah. Like talking to him and like just seeing these machinations, like you've actually did it, right? You were the one who was self-made. You kind of became this very important figure in media circles. Mm-hmm. So I would think as someone who's put in the work, like it would be especially galling to see social climbing for someone like you.
Well, I think nobody's entirely self-made, but there's a level of obliviousness that some people have. And with Jared, at one point, we had an actual discussion about this probably a month into the job. He had never really asked me anything about my personal background. And I think he assumed, because I had done Gawker, that I grew up in New York or something. Sure. So we go to breakfast, and he says, so, what do your parents do? They work in media? And I said, no, my dad's a local lineman for Alabama Power. My mom was a janitor at the school I went to, and then later worked for Alabama Power, too, which is now a Southern company. And he looked just sort of taken aback. And so I kept sort of just chit-chatting, and I mentioned that my dad had done contracting on the side and sort of had a contracting business that he started. And Jared said something like, well, I can relate to your dad then. I'm kind of a self-made man myself. And, I was just, my reaction was, go on.
This is going to be good.
I want to hear this. And his sort of justification for it was that he sort of considered anything that was vaguely entrepreneurial as a sort of self-made arc for people. So So I asked him, I said, well, what was the first, just going with it. It's like, what was the first?
We got to pause here. We have to pause. Yeah. Because people don't know you as well as I know you and haven't been a fan of yours as much as I have. But what people aren't appreciating at home is this is the Elizabeth Spiers mind in action, where you're very petite, perfect straight face. You're like, like complete poker face. This person is talking literal shit. Makes complete no sense, but you're like, Well,
I think this is also a journalistic skill.
Sure.
When people start talking in that way, you just let them talk. Like, you don't
because it's gonna be gold. There's no way, given this is the finale, that this season's not gonna have some twists and turns. So let's hear what happened.
Yeah. So I said, well, what was the first business you started? Not expecting a lemonade stand or anything, but he was like, well, I was buying up residential property in Cambridge and flipping it, and that's not exactly flipping burgers, to get through college. But in his mind, he really buys that narrative. Like, he's deluded himself about the extent to which he's, where he is because of his family's money, because dad bought his way into Harvard. And, a lot of people who grow up with that kind of money are delusional anyway, but Jared is definitely on this spectrum of people that I met. Like, not even sort of born on third base. It's more like, born at mile 27, or, the last inch of a marathon, just crossing the line. And Ivanka's like that too. So they're kind of well matched, and they reinforce each other in terms of their shared narrative.
How I can't get a read on her. I can't tell if she is Mean Girls or if she's like the most sane and down to earth of all of them, or if this is just some kind of artifice she portrays somewhat convincingly.
Yeah, she is a mean girl. She's media trained in a way that the other Trump kids aren't, because she was in the spotlight since she was a preteen. So she's very aware, and I think women are more aware anyway that they're being watched or being evaluated in certain ways. So she's less likely to stick her foot in her mouth than the Trump boys are. And she has a lot more polish, which is why I think when they first went to D.C., people were kind of thinking, well, maybe they'll moderate Trump in some way. Because people will mistake polish, and this is a class issue, for intelligence.
Right.
And sometimes just being polished and seeming to be better behaved for some kind of integrity where there is none.
Well, this is also kind of the British accent. Americans assume British people are more intelligent than us, where often they're just as dumb as everybody else. And also, you're seeing this from your background, like with my work in North Korea. When the North Koreans escape to South Korea, they have what the equivalent of like deep South accents, and everyone in the South just writes them off and thinks they're just completely dumb. And it's just like, this is just how I talk. This has nothing to do with the quality of my mind or anything like that. Hey guys, I want to talk to you about Blue Blocks. That's BLUBLOX.com. They have a huge sale going on. You get 20% off any order under $160 with the code SAVE20. 25% off any order over $160 with the code SAVE25. What are they? Blue Blocks are these incredible blue light glasses that block the blue light coming off your screens that's causing your eye strain. If you've been spending all day looking at your phone, let's be honest, who hasn't during the pandemic, looking at your computer, looking at your TV, you're starting to get headaches or feeling like your energy is low or you're having trouble sleeping. Blue Blocks is here to help. They've got over 40 pairs to choose from. Look at me in this ad. Don't I look pretty cool? Unlike that hunk who's the latest sheath underwear model. Anyway, if you go to blueblocks.com, BLUBLOX.com, use promo code SAVE20, 20% off, SAVE25, 25% off orders over $160. They're available in prescription. They're available in non-prescription. They're available in readers. They have frames for every need. And every pair you buy, Blue Blocks donates a pair of reading glasses to someone in need. That's pretty good. Less headaches for you, more eyesight for them. Let's get back to the show. What was your thought process? I would love to hear this because I'm sure this is going to be a long, hilarious answer of watching Trump announce, then watching him get the nomination, then seeing him win, when this is like your boss's dad. Yeah. And also, as a fan of Spy Magazine, people don't realize that the jokes about Trump's hands came from Graydon Carter's Spy Magazine, where Trump was referred to. This is something Spy did very well. This is something Gawker did very well. They have these little epithets for people, like Eagle-Eyed Athena, but with Trump, it's stubby-fingered vulgarian.
Short-fingered vulgarian, yes. Yeah. Well, it's Kurt Anderson, who was one of the co-founders of Spy, is a friend of mine, and And it's been interesting to talk to him about all of this. I think, they were maybe hoping, I guess, that Spy would have, sort of destroyed the phenomenon that was Donald Trump by just exposing what a charlatan he was, because they did some really great reporting on his casino bankruptcies and his corruption. And it's kind of surreal to live in New York and kind of know who Donald Trump is, because he's been around forever. He's run for president like 400 times, which is also part of the reason why people didn't take him seriously in the run up to the primary, because he'd done this every single cycle since the late 90s. And then he got some momentum this last time, in part, I think, because the Republican Party were so slow to get behind a more moderate candidate. And then they were sort of taken by surprise when, the moderates started splitting the votes. I don't think any of them really anticipated that Trump was going to be their candidate.
Certainly not, yeah.
And then they were stuck with him.
Yeah.
Trump was running in 2011, I think, whenever I took the Observer job. So Jared and I had some fights about it because we sort of determined that there was no way the Observer could cover Trump objectively when Ivanka's a part owner.
Yeah.
But you can't pretend that he doesn't exist. So our sort of compromise was, we'll aggregate other stories about Trump, in the politics section, but we're not going to pretend that we can profile him or do anything like that. And it wasn't the best. It wasn't an optimal solution for the politics desk because Trump was starting to get a little bit of momentum then. And so Jared and I had one just throwdown fight where my office was a kind of plexiglass office with a door that sort of led out into the bullpen, and the politics desk was like right next to my door. So Jared and I were having a fight on the phone, and it just kept escalating, and then we were kind of yelling at each other. And what had happened was the political section had aggregated a story by the New York Times about Trump. And it was a big, high-profile story. It wasn't flattering to Trump because Trump never does anything that would be flattering to himself. All we did was link to it with a summary. And Jared called me furious and said, you guys are making an editorial choice there.
It's the Times.
Why can't you, link to things that are positive about Trump? And I said, well, first of all, your father-in-law has to do something positive.
Wait, I got to interrupt you because it's like, where do you want him to link? Like InfoWars? Like who? No one at this time is.
That was my argument too. I said the Times is not an obscure blog. We have to. This is a dominant story today. Like we can't pretend it didn't happen. I said unless you want to, go have a policy where we completely exclude Trump from all coverage.
Right.
I said, in which case, I don't know how that's going to make our political coverage even tenable, because he is in the middle of all this stuff. But when we were fighting about it, I realized my door was open and the politics desk was hearing all of it. And I started to get up and shut it. And then I thought, I'm just going to leave it open. But I really thought I was going to get fired that weekend because I was only 3 or 4 months into the Observer job. And I thought I'm going to be the shortest tenured Observer editor ever. And I called Stephen Rubenstein, who's a friend of Jared's, and they're close. So I called Stephen and I said, I don't know what to do here because Jared's on the verge of trying to either make us do positive coverage of Trump, which we absolutely can't do. My politics desk would resign or I'd have to resign, or both. And I just don't have a good solution for this. And what do you think? And Stephen said something like, well, what you're dealing with is a value clash. For you, it's about needing to do journalism with integrity. And for him, he views this as a family loyalty issue. And I said, yeah, but, he can get yelled at by his father-in-law once, which, by the way, his father's not. Trump wasn't going to yell at Jared over Observer coverage. They didn't have that kind of relationship, really. I said, but I can't do something that, first of all, I can't look at myself in the mirror, and when I get up in the morning, and I'm not going to do something that I think is unethical.
And how would you get away with it either? It's like if the Observer keeps ignoring the New York Times coverage of Trump, that's what's going to go unnoticed? That doesn't make any sense.
Well, this is also something where Jared bought the newspaper for prestige reasons without really understanding how journalism works, certainly not wanting to support journalists. In fact, he still blames the New Jersey media and Chris Christie for his father's arrest and indictment. So he hates journalists, and one of the things that I tried to do is just keep him out of the bullpen because he was condescending to everyone on my staff, because he just doesn't understand what motivates people who go into journalism. He thinks that they're suckers because they didn't go into commercial real estate or do anything that actually makes money.
Like self-made men are.
Why would anyone take a low-paying job?
At the very least, flip houses in New Haven.
Yes.
Come on, people. Do I have to teach you everything?
101.
Yeah, this is basic stuff.
Yeah.
When you're 22, you buy your townhouse and you flip it.
Yeah.
How long did that tenure? Because a lot of the fights you had with Jared ended up spilling out into the mainstream. Yeah. Was that something that you felt uncomfortable becoming the story? Like you being part of the story?
No, because I think I was used to it. Like I didn't, from Gawker on, every time I did a new media venture, somebody would cover it. So it wasn't like, at least within the context of media coverage, I was accustomed to that kind of scrutiny. And I also just remember when I was at Gawker, Nick and I had these conversations about, leaking from the journalism side, and who would leak and why. And so anytime I talked to staff or wrote a memo, I just wrote it with something in mind. Like I want to be able to have everything I do feel good enough to me that if I read about it in the New York Times the next day, I'd be fine with it.
Yeah.
So with that as kind of an overriding principle, it definitely clarifies like what you can and can't do and should be doing. So yeah, I mean, sometimes it was uncomfortable because I don't particularly like the spotlight. I like people to read the things that I write, which is a very different impulse. But it comes with the territory a little bit. So it's like you want the big fancy job, you get the scrutiny.
Yeah.
So.
What advice would you give to people who are having to talk to journalists about how not to have it be a bad experience for them? Like, what are motivating those journalists so people have a better understanding? Because it's very easy to just, regard them as them and then your SOL.
Yeah, I wrote something pretty recently about this because I also have always had a, one foot in the tech industry, kind of in digital media. And I wrote about the Slate Star Kodak story that the Times had done.
Scott Alexander, Yeah,
I have a Substack. It's called like mynewbandis.substack.com. And the angle of my thing was that the people who are big fans of the site were attributing all kinds of bad faith to the journalists who'd done the story, but in ways that were so over the top that it was more a function of just not really understanding how a newsroom works, not understanding what motivates a journalist. So I kind of said, look, one thing you need to understand is this reporter is working on probably 8 stories at once.
Yeah.
He's not particularly invested in Scott's life. He's not sitting around thinking, like, how can I make this guy miserable? That's not how anybody approaches journalism, or not how any serious journalist approaches journalism. But it's also not that guy's job to be a PR person and this is a big problem in tech. Like, the tech industry was not covered very aggressively for decades because it wasn't a center of power in this country. And then it really became one in the end of the last century, but only now is it getting the kind of scrutiny that, for instance, Wall Street has gotten for a century at least, and people aren't used to that. And there's a thing in the tech industry where there's always a kind of moral rationale for whatever you're building. It's nobody who starts a hedge fund says they're going to do it to change the world, but nearly everybody who starts an app in Silicon Valley says, we're doing this to change people's lives for the better. And it gives them what they think of sometimes as an out for bad behavior. Like, well, why are you criticizing me? I'm just trying to change the world.
Right.
And because the scrutiny is new too, they're used to trade coverage.
Yeah.
Which is overwhelmingly positive because that's how trade coverage operates.
It's copy and paste from a press release often.
Yeah. Or it's just repeating transactional information. Yeah. And so sometimes they conflate cheerleadery stories with, legitimate journalism. So there was a post by the CEO of Coinbase the other day where he said something like, what needs to happen is all these companies need to go directly to their audiences. And, they can already do that. Like, it's like you're writing this on Medium. You're already doing that.
Right.
And they wonder why they don't have the credibility of, like, a New York Times in doing that. It's because you're an unreliable narrator of your own experience. And also, of course, your view of your own company is going to be unalloyed positivity because you're not capable of being on the outside and looking inward at yourself. So some of it's just, people not understanding what the point of journalism is, too. It's not to and I've had this discussion with people I respect in the Valley. It's not to promote tech or support tech. It's to cover it, and to be removed enough that when bad things happen, you talk about them. And so a question that I get whenever I say that, like I said that in a Clubhouse chat a few weeks ago, and they were like, well, but why aren't there positive stories about tech? I said, there are, but, we have a negativity bias naturally as humans. So if you pull out an issue of Fast Company, like 90% of the coverage is positive. But if there's one negative story, that's the one you're going to latch onto. And
you're not even going to register as positive. You're going to register as factual. It's like, oh, here's this new app who's helping people date in this every way. You don't register as positive story. You just register as, oh, I'm learning information about this app, but it is positive.
Exactly. Yeah.
What advice would you? I had a friend who's a publicist, and it's exactly what you were speaking about. How people in the Valley think of media. Like he got hired as a publicist by these big startups. He would email various reporters about, hey, here's why I think I'm working on the startup. Here's why I think this would be a good story for you. A, B, and C. These are the kind of talking points, and he'd give it to the clients to look over. And they would like cross it out and just basically put all their slang and jargon and like all their little catchphrases about their app. And he would ignore it. Mm-hmm. He's like, you don't understand. Like, because in their head, they're like, I built this app. I'm hiring a publicist, paying him a lot of money. And that publicist is going to be able to like touch the journalist in the head, download all these words. And the journalist verbatim would be like, oh, great. You wrote the story for me. I don't have to do any work. That is completely removed from how the process actually is. And not only that, in my experience, and please correct me, journalists get resentful when you're trying to spoon feed them how the story should look, because then they're like, okay, this is going to make me look bad if I'm just a stooge. And what are you not trying to tell me? Yeah,
I think it's more I think most journalists have a sort of skepticism inherently when they're covering stuff like this. So if somebody's really going out of their way to be evasive or not answer questions directly, that's always kind of a red flag. It's like, well, what is it that you don't want to tell me? And there's also some just misunderstanding about how the process works. So I had a conversation with, I really got along with Josh Kushner, Jared's younger brother, who's a venture capitalist. He's probably not allowed to speak to me anymore, but
I heard he's self-made.
Everyone in that family is. But we were having this conversation. I'd started a tech site called Beta Beat for The Observer. And it had The Observer's usual kind of, dark wit, sometimes snarky tone. It wasn't particularly reverent toward the industry. I don't think it was overly negative. In fact, it was pretty in line with The Observer's coverage generally. But the first day, I had a guy who was doing a column that would just kind of skewer whatever he thought was the worst tech idea that got funded that week. And he wrote a column about a company called Hashable that's no longer around.
Okay.
And talked about why he just thought it was dumb. And the tone of the column was like an Andy Rooney kind of thing.
Okay.
Where it was just, I'm going to get off my lawn. And it was a funny piece, but the entrepreneur was enraged by it. And called or was sending the guy who wrote it like threatening emails. He was sending the guy's editor threatening emails and saying, if you do this again, I'm going to make you pay. And, if I see you in person. And one of his investors, who I know and like, emailed me and said, congratulations on launching the site, but I have to ask you, if you're negative about tech all the time, who's going to talk to you? And I said, well, first of all, how many negative stories do you think we did this week?
Right.
And he said, I don't know. And I said, I think we did 35 stories this week and 3 were negative. But you're only remembering like the 3 that were negative. And I said, people will talk to us if they feel like what we're doing is reflective of reality on the ground. And I had the same conversation with Josh Kushner where he said, I think we wrote something negative about someone he was friends with. And Josh never really pushed back on anything that we did. In fact, he told me at one point he refused to read Beta Beat specifically so that he wouldn't get into arguments with me about it.
Okay. Whatever works.
Yeah, I was like, I'm fine with that policy.
I'm okay with this.
Maybe you could convince Jared to do that.
Yeah.
But he said, if you alienate these entrepreneurs, they're not going to tell you when they have a big story. I said, Josh, that's not how 90% of journalism happens. Yeah. Like what's going to happen is if somebody does something that's, warrants coverage and it's bad, people who hate them are going to tell us that story. Their employees are going to tell us that story, not them. I said, you didn't get, Woodward and Bernstein didn't get Watergate from Nixon. Like, it just is complete misunderstanding of how the reporting process works, how sourcing works. But it's not uncommon. Like, so the people you're talking about who expect stenography from journalists, it's because they usually have some experience of that actually happening that way, and it comes, again, from, I think, trade coverage, and some of the trades do operate like that. They're
sure.
Yeah.
Because again, it's a lot easier to just copy press release, but that's very different from like a Beta Beat or something like that, or a Fast Company, where they're speaking to a broad audience and not just inside house, where people understand these are press releases.
Yeah.
Why do you think journalists have such a bad reputation in America in 2021? And what advice would you give them as an occupation to try to turn that around, or is it not their fault?
Well, I think some of it's their fault and some of it isn't. One of the things that we see across the board is that confidence in institutions is declined across the board, and that includes media.
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't help when the president gets up and calls the press the enemy of the people, or they try to completely discredit the role that a free press plays in making sure we have a healthy democracy. And there's a kind of neo-reactionary undertone to some of these discussions about tech and journalism that sort of revolves around the idea that maybe democracy is not a legitimate enterprise. And so the people who really believe that, and they're a little fringy. That's the Peter Thiel's, Balaji Srinivasan. They understand that free press is directly related to the ability to maintain democracy, but they're just not that pro-democracy.
Yeah.
Peter
said explicitly democracy and liberty are not compatible.
Yeah, they'd prefer to live in a kind of corporate state where a kind of feudalism is acceptable. So I don't think it's a coincidence that they have issues with the kind of journalism that actually is about fact-finding. And that attitude, I think, has been perpetuated by some people on the right who are particularly sympathetic to Trump because, he's always been able to kind of get away with things because nobody could ever hold him accountable in a way that had any teeth.
Right.
He had so much debt. The worst that the banks could do is just cut him off. Where people have tried to investigate him, he's never really faced any consequences. And that might change now. It's hard to, tell where all the stuff that's winding its way through SDNY is going to end up. But when you're used to that, you develop a sense of entitlement that anybody who's putting out an alternative narrative is persecuting you. So Trump is, in ways, manipulating his constituency and using the media to do it.
Yeah, hold on. Because you could say with a straight face and even believe, people have been trying to get me for decades. I'm not in jail. Nothing's come of it. I still have my solid gold toilet. Yep. This is just personal animus because I'm a winner and they're a loser, and they're not going to give up because I keep beating them with their own game.
Yeah,
that's the psychology.
And he's a narcissist, and he's got a sort of arrested development thing too that I think people don't understand. They tend to project strategic motives onto him, and when I think a lot of his behavior is just it's much simpler. There was somebody who knew him growing up who told me that. Because Fred was so abusive.
The dad.
He would come home and Fred would just, scream at him and hit him. And he would just try to say or do anything that would make him stop or make him, behave more favorably to him. And he would just try things until something worked. And so if you think of it in that context, it sort of explains a lot of his behavior across the board. He's kind of like a human A/B test. He'll throw something out and see how people react to it. And that's why, he changes messages every other day because what works today might not work tomorrow. Yeah,
he hires somebody, Secretary of State. This guy's the best. You ever seen anything like it? And then when he leaves, he was a moron. Why did I hire him? He was a complete screw from day one. It's just but you hired him.
Yeah, no fear of being inconsistent because that sort of A/B strategies, worked for him and I guess protected him probably as a kid.
What was it like so I have defended Rosie O'Donnell on many occasions because I've said because she's tweeting about she paints Trump all the time and all this other stuff and I said, listen, if your bully became president, you'd think reality is having a breakdown also. I mean, whoever pushed me around back in the day, and now that they're in the White House and they're shaking hands with Kim Jong-un and Netanyahu, I'm like, I don't understand what's happening on my screen anymore. Like, this is not real. Yeah. What was it like for you, having had that relationship with Jared and the family, seeing him in charge of American Middle East policy?
I mean, it's still surreal. Okay. It's especially for somebody who Jared is maybe the most incurious person I've ever worked with.
That's a really bad word.
Yeah.
That in this context, that's really bad.
But keep in mind, he also, if you consider that the one thing he cares about more than anything is status, you can also sort of figure out, like, everything he's done has been predictable, because he wanted to be in situations where he would be in the room with people he would never have access to otherwise, and he knows that. But he's never been interested in politics or policy or, any of that. So when they went to Washington, they had to sort of concoct this narrative that they were there for a reason, that they had, real public service ambitions, which that's maybe the most laughable part of it. But it was strange to watch people think that, again, because they seem relatively polished, compared to the rest of the administration, that they might be the voice of reason in any of this. And to me, it's like if Jared Kushner is the smartest person in the room, that's more reflective of the room than Jared Kushner's intelligence in the state of the room. So, it was strange to see. Also, it was strange to see mainstream media people who should really know better attributing all kinds of capabilities and strategic thinking to him, just because he seemed like the sane person in the room with all these lunatics, and they couldn't really understand that might be true in that specific room. But, if you put Jared in any other context, he's unremarkable, demonstrably not interested in politics or policy. And, he took on this wide portfolio of things because he thinks of it like, I don't know, like I'm going to dip my finger in all these things where I want to have some influence, but I also don't want accountability for any of it. And that's kind of that was a recurring theme of working for him. If he made a bad decision, somebody else's fault. And he would declare it a success.
Yeah. You had a career of lots of extremely powerful people getting upset with you, and you are extremely unflappable, even though you are tiny. Yeah. And so what advice would you give to young people, especially young women, who it works in media, it works in publishing, it works everywhere. Older men, older women will use their power to bully and to intimidate to get whatever they want. It's a very effective technique, especially when you're young, you're scared. This big shot's going to ruin my life. How do you manage to not go to the bathroom and cry all the time?
Yeah. I go to the bathroom and cry maybe once a year.
Okay.
But I don't, the thing is, for me, I already have that kind of temperament, I'm not that demonstrative emotionally. I never have been, which is not always, it's double-edged sword if you're a woman.
Sure.
That also causes people to suggest that you're cold or you're aloof. And in a lot of cases, you're just bored. So there's, but also...
I wasn't being a bitch. I was being sleepy.
Yeah. Tired. Yeah. I had a job before Gawker where I was working as an equity analyst for this hedge fund guy. And my job was to go in and do due diligence for these kind of crappy companies that were small mid-cap companies. And there was always something wrong with them. So he was an activist investor. And usually whatever was wrong with them was blindingly obvious. You'd go visit the company and there would be a Lamborghini in the parking lot. And you'd be like, well, that's probably on a corporate lease.
Yeah,
and it would be. And so there would be a lot of garden variety mismanagement. But I was always, I was 22, 23 at the time. And I was always having to go in and interrogate some, CFO or CEO who invariably were baby boomers, who would start the conversation with, listen, young lady, and it would go downhill from there. And so I just got used to asking people questions where they were starting from a point of hostility. They did not want me to be there. And it was good in the sense that it sort of inured me to that. I became less afraid of those people. which is a good journalistic instinct to have. It's not great for self-preservation. And I think my self-preservation instinct just got further eroded the more time I spent in journalism. So I get, I get threats and stuff like that. And occasionally I'll get something that's kind of worrisome, and I try to send it through the proper channels. And you do some basic things to kind of protect yourself, both in terms of mental health and sometimes just literally. So I don't know. For me, it helps to compartmentalize a little bit and understand that, particularly when people are threatening you on the internet, they are out of their minds when they're doing it. There was one guy who sent me I wrote something about Lauren Boebert in the Washington Post.
Yeah, she followed
and
me.
Her fan base is kind of exactly who you would think it was. So some guy sent me an email that was basically like...
For those who don't know, Lauren Boebert's the congresswoman from Colorado, I believe.
Yeah.
And she got in trouble because she wanted to pack her gun on the floor of the Congress, and she's definitely like a post-Trump new right figure.
QAnon curious. This guy... sent me an email that said something like, I hope you get gang raped by ISIS. And there's just a litany of threats that were, and I get stuff like that sometimes, but I in this case, I screenshotted part of it and I put it on Twitter and I said something like, wow, Lauren Boebert's fans are exactly who I thought they would be. And somebody emailed me later and said, oh, that guy harassed a friend of mine, and then copied me into an email chain that they had where the guy, whose name was Mike, runs some kind of business in Nevada, and the person's assistant was responding to him and saying, I'm going to send your email to the FBI. Like, we know who you are and where you work. And this guy backtracked immediately and said, I'm so sorry. I didn't really mean to hurt, and he was threatening her. He was saying, I'm going to find you. And he said, I figured she's a public figure. She can take criticism.
I could take there's a criticism in gang rape.
Yeah. There's like a certain kind of...
Why does it got to be ISIS? Does that make it worse?
There's a...
I like the idea that, you think your gang rape was bad. I got gang raped by terrorists. Oh, now that's real trauma.
They're never very creative.
I know, but it's just okay, yeah.
But this guy, there's a kind of internet culture, and especially with men and younger men, where they just become convinced that... if you threaten somebody, it's the same as, critiquing somebody. And you see this all over Twitter. Like, you try to have a decent argument with somebody who disagrees with you, and then all of a sudden they're like, shut up, bitch. And then it's like, well, there went the conversation, that's not a critique. So some of it is not differentiating between threatening and critique. And you see that it gets exacerbated a little bit when you talk about it in the context of particularly women online. Because we do get a kind of harassment that men just don't. I'm not saying men never get rape threats.
No, but all my friends on the right are kind of blind to this. There's certain liberties that people take when they are attacking women online that you wouldn't have with men. It's going to get much more personal. It's just going to be much more about appearance. It's just going to be much more individual, as opposed to, oh, you're a dumb bitch who hates Trump, which is like, okay, fine. But that's very different from going after someone, how they look, and I hope you get raped. These are not that this is nice, but it's certainly a lot more understandable in a social media context. Yeah, there's a difference between I disagree with what you said and I thought it was stupid, and that doesn't bother me. I don't care if somebody... Maybe you're right. And I'm going to beat the shit out of you. Yeah. That's and to me, it's like anybody with more than 2 brain cells understands that difference, but somehow it's been sort of distorted in internet dialogue. And I've seen even people who should be smarter about this stuff do that. There was Glenn Greenwald went after Taylor Lorenz a while ago, and he was like, oh, this Times reporter can't take criticism. And I was like, Glenn, she can't take rape threats. There's a big difference. Do you think now that Trump is out of office that we are going to kind of calm down as a culture and have less of this antagonism online?
No, and here's why. I think, Trump is gone, but Trumpism isn't. Yeah. And there's this really scary strain of anti-democratic sentiment that I think is anti-majoritarian. It has authoritarian strains to it. And I see it, especially, where I grew up, and you have a lot of, white evangelicals who, and you saw it in the sort of January 6th situation. There are people who... Because these people are not necessarily ideologically consistent about, and they in a lot of cases not aware that what they're advocating for is a strain of authoritarianism. But you see it in particular with, I think, this is sort of libertarian types who are also like waving Blue Lives Matter flags. And not concerned at all about like over militarization of the police.
Don't get me started. Yeah, that's been my issue. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and those things, there's not a lot of room for people to actually synthesize these positions into anything resembling a consensus. And especially if your narrative is, I'm being displaced in some way. Like it's disturbing to me to see replacement theory coming into like mainstream media context, and then there not being much reaction, when Tucker Carlson gets up on Fox and basically advocates for it. And I don't know if it's just people are exhausted or they can't really wrap their heads around what the possible consequences to all of this are.
Hey guys, today's episode is brought to you by Sheath Underwear. Sheath makes the most comfortable boxer briefs I've ever worn, and their latest underwear model is such a hunk and a stud combined. You never see anything like it. It's just amazing. We get so many emails. Who is this hunk that's in your ads? Well, you'll have to see it to believe it. If you go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code Malice20, you get 20% off your order. And what you get is boxers that are made out of moisture wicking technology that are super soft, keep everything cool, smooth, and in place. I'm wearing them now. And what makes Sheath unique is they've got this dual pouch technology for both parts of your man stuff. You try them on, you're like, what's happening here? And then you're like, oh, I get it. This stuff is really, really great. Did I mention that their latest models are real stud and hunk? If you go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code Malice20, you get 20% off your order. You could try out their new bamboo underwear. You could try out their mesh underwear. And let's get back to the show. Well, my concern, I said this when I was on Rogan, is I spent some time in the Midwest not that long ago, rural Illinois, and they were ready for guillotines. Like, you understand this coming from Alabama and also being savvy in terms of, the population, reading between the lines. And I said this on Rogan, I go, you guys are playing a very dangerous game, that when you have a population that is marginalized and is also then by you made into the butt of jokes, in every other context, you understand that young men who have nothing to lose, who are in a corner, you keep poking them, some of them are going to do something you really, really don't like. And when you really don't like, it's not like rape threats. It's like really doing depraved, horrific things. Yeah. And you need to appreciate that this is a situation that's going on right now. And I said, if they started putting up guillotines, I think a lot of corporate journalists would be tripping over themselves, laughing at how dull the blades are. And I'm glad you appreciate that there is just how bad this subtext is in terms of, violence sings its own song. Yeah. And if things like this get out of hand, they get even just the protest versus the rioting last year. Once things get out of hand, you don't want that to happen because it's really going to kind of snowball.
Yeah. Well, there's also, to go back to the trust of the media issue, people, at least in polls, they do trust their local journalists. Right. And there is a problem where so much of the media that they watch is very disconnected from where they live. Right. So I go home and I have relatives who are like, fucking liberal media people. And I'm like, I'm the only liberal I'm the only media person you know. And then they're like, oh, no, I'm not talking about you. But they have this caricature in their heads of what a journalist is, what a journalist looks like. In their mind, they're all raging leftists. And some of it is they don't have a connection to the media industry. They probably don't know anybody who's a journalist at all. Or if they do, it's maybe a reporter for their tiny hometown newspaper. Yeah. And those publications, in a lot of cases, are covering, community stuff, but not broader issues. And that lack of connection to organizations that are trying to tell the truth and are trying to put out a narrative that's about reality on the ground has just been eroded completely. And partly because local news is dying for economic reasons. But the upshot of it is just that it makes it so much easier for people to buy into conspiracy theories that fit a narrative that they like. Every time I get, my dad right now is a little bit vaccine hesitant. And, I went home for my grandmother died a few weeks ago, and I went home for her funeral. And we talked about it. And he sort of went over the objections that he has. And whenever I would ask him for I said, well, where did you get that? He said, well, I've done my research, which is sort of my nightmare phrase every time. Like, where exactly? And it's always something that if it's not a literal meme somewhere, it's like a...
Wait, I love the boomer brain. Yeah. Well, listen, this meme had 8,000 words on it, so that is research of a sort.
Yeah, but it's also, when you're in an ideologically monolithic area, I can tell it's not my dad Googling things. It's him being surrounded by other people who believe exactly the same thing, and they are more credentialized in his mind than a legitimate news source. And for whatever reason, I think in the Deep South, because there's a lot of vaccination resistance, especially among white, non-college educated evangelicals, which is my dad.
That's the mark of the beast. No, I mean, that was a concern.
Oh, yeah, no, that was one of them. My dad's not particularly religious.
Sure, but
he grew up culturally Southern Baptist, but he's not in that sort of conspiracy territory. But when the J&J vaccine had there were 5 people with blood clots, my dad was like, well, but, and I said, Dad, that's like I said, if you get COVID, there's a 16% chance of having a blood clot. And also all the people who had it were women. It's probably hormonal birth control. And I reminded him that he's not on hormonal birth control. And, but at least we can talk about it because he's not in conspiracy territory.
Hold on. You yada the best part. So Elizabeth Spiers at home in Alabama, when you said you reminded him that he's not on birth control, what was the tone?
Well, my dad and I have the same sense of humor.
Okay, there we go.
He's very dry and deadpan too, and he's got a mischief-making streak.
Okay.
My mom. I have my birth family. I was adopted, and I know my birth mom, and we have a relationship too. And she's conservative. She's half Mexican indigenous. So she's one of the Trump Latinas for Trump.
I love it. Wait, I love it. Little Elizabeth back home. You're like, all right, I found my birth mom. Finally, someone I could talk about politics. And she's like, Trump is going to build a wall to save us from us.
Yeah. No, that's my Hispanic side of my family is very much we did it the right way. Which we absolutely did not.
Oh my God, I love
There's no visa program, and it's crazy. But so my dad and I are very similar, and I don't know who my biological father is, so this is my adopted dad. And then my mom and I really are not. My mom's super earnest, like super, and so if you, especially if you have a little bit of like gallows humor the way that I do.
Oh no.
She always takes it very literally and is very upset. So I just have to remember not to
all the time growing up.
Not to make those jokes around my mom. But my dad loves it. So and my dad and I can argue like in a way that's productive and not, we're not.
Well, what advice would you give people who don't have that privilege with their family? Yeah. I think that's a huge blessing you have, that like to have any relationship with anyone and know we can argue about these issues till we're blue in the face, and there's literally zero possibility we're going to care for each other less. Like, how would you encourage that to happen in this country?
I think it's hard because it also sort of boils down to, what the reasoning is behind the, political stance. And a lot of people, some people vote because they like a specific policy.
Sure.
For other people, it's about a value system. I feel like, if I felt like the people in my family were voting the way that they do for reasons that I really considered abhorrent, it would damage our relationship. And we do have some, there are some gulfs that we have because of it. I articulated to them why, I thought Trump was insidious. And I do believe that the Republican Party is completely embraced a sort of bigoted view of the world that I don't know how they could walk that back. Like, I just don't. I look at the Never Trumpers talking about reforming the party, and I'm like, I think that ship has sailed. And so I don't want to see my family members sinking deeper into it. But, we try to have these conversations about, why we believe these things that are kind of built around shared history. So, I was talking to my birth mom, his name is Maria, and we were arguing about something, but I have 3 siblings too on birth side. And we're all super opinionated and stubborn. And so sometimes whenever I get in an argument with Maria, she kind of laughs about it. She's like, oh, it's Flora's side of the family. It's everybody's. I'm not particularly hot-headed, but I have the stamina to argue about things forever. Yeah. And I don't mind an argument. Like, I'm not particularly afraid of confrontation. So it also helps that, I think, at least for my family, they've gotten used to it because I've been arguing with them since I was 8. So they kind of know how to deal with me. But the other thing is just you have to sort of start from the place of really trying to understand why how they're justifying to themselves what they're doing. And at one point, Maria sent me something that was like obviously a QAnon conspiracy thing. And so I just sort of calmly explained to her where it came from.
Yeah. Your eyes just rolled despite yourself.
I know.
Wait, you explained to her it came from 4chan and what 4chan is?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, it's sometimes you have to translate these things. And it's also about like where you have credibility and where you don't. Sure. My parents absolutely give me credibility for understanding the internet.
Fair.
So if something's coming from some dark corner of 4chan, sometimes Maria will send me something and be like, is this real or not? And I'm like, it never is. So
she's doing her research.
Yeah, well, sort of, yeah. I have an uncle who likes to, or for a while, was just an epic shit poster. And I would go into his Facebook and leave a comment like, Uncle Chico, this is totally Photoshopped, and it's like, and I don't know that it had like a big effect, but I did find that whenever they had to defend these things to me, they sort of like toned it down a little bit.
Yeah.
Or they toned down the rhetoric, especially about, how horrible liberals are.
Okay.
Because they discovered they had one,
No, not you. You'll get to live in the attic.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I have someone I know, and they were doing a podcast, and they're half Lebanese, and the girl was like, oh, blah, blah, talking about Lebanon, and she was like, oh, I only learned I was half Lebanese 5 years ago, and the interviewer didn't pick up on that. I'm like, that's a really interesting point. So what I want to know is, what was it like for you learning that you're a woman of color?
Well, I found my original birth certificate when I was like 11 or 12.
Okay.
And my mother's last name is like a super common Hispanic name. So I figured it was likely that she was. So, and also I knew I probably wasn't entirely white because I look in the mirror sometimes. And first time I met Maria, I was asking her something about my grandfather. And we both have my grandfather's nose, but she sort of like smiled at me and sort of did this.
Yeah.
So I kind of had a hunch, but I think my parents, because it somehow had not occurred to them that somebody with that name might be Latina, were surprised by it. They're like, oh, interesting.
But was it weird, like meeting someone who's like, this is your, like, what's that like meeting your biological mom?
Well, I had a actually really good experience, but not everybody does, So I tried to find my bio mom before, and I'm pretty decent with public records because, being a journalist, but there was no father on my birth certificate listed. And so, public records are usually, if it's a property record or something like that, in man's name because patriarchy. So I couldn't really find anything for her. And at one point I even tried to hire a PI to look.
Oh, wow.
And it was a private adoption, so all the lawyers involved with it.
Of a Kind. That was the website. Did you work on Of a Kind?
Yeah, I was an advisor to them.
See?
Yeah.
I wasn't making it up, and I wasn't wrong. It took an hour, but my Biden brain came up with it. I sat here, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I did know what I was talking about.
Yeah, I was on their advisory board.
Thank you. Okay.
But that's why I was confused. I was like, I don't think I launched this.
But you helped. Okay, good. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. So I found my uncle via 23andMe.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Somebody in the sort of like California part of the family, which most of my ancestors moved from like Mexico to California and just stayed there. But my grandfather joined the Army and was in the 82nd Airborne, and he ended up stationed in Georgia and then Alabama. So then he married my grandmother. They had 7 kids, all of whom grew up in Alabama. And my grandfather, I think my mom kind of passes as a white person, but my grandfather definitely didn't. And then my generation, everybody passes.
Okay.
So, but when I met my mother for the first time, she has the same kind of like dry deadpan thing I do. So she was standing outside of her house, chain smoking, wearing a T-shirt that said something like "Don't mess with old ladies who love Aerosmith."
Yeah.
And we look exactly alike, like in a freaky way. So I'm like, well, that's what I'm going to look like when I'm 70, I guess. But it was strange because I had never seen, with the exception of my son, who looks a lot more like my husband, if you've never seen another human who physically looks like you, it's mind-boggling. Like your brain thinks it's being poisoned. So the first few minutes we were talking, like I couldn't even process what she was saying because I felt like I was staring at a mirror image of myself. And my brain was just rejecting it, like, on principle. But it ended up being, really great because I worried that I would find them and they wouldn't want to have anything to do with me. And it was quite the opposite. They had been hoping that I would find them.
Oh, that's lovely.
And I had 3 siblings. 2 of them were older than I was. So my sister Bobby, who just retired from the National Guard like a couple of months ago, sent me this Facebook message when all this was happening, and I was doing jury duty in New York, or grand jury duty. And so I had my phone on, and she sent me this message that said something like, and this is my first communication with her, I remember you. I'm so glad you're back in our lives. And it was just really sweet. So and then of course the ADA is like, turn your phone off. So I did. And I was
so she sees seen.
Yeah. And, the ADA is probably like, why is your 20 so emotional?
Why is this Mexican lady crying?
So I feel like I won the lottery in that respect. Although weirdly, my biological family lives like 15 minutes from my adopted family. So we probably like walked past each other all through my childhood. I worked at Walmart in high school and as a cashier. Like there's statistically speaking, like they probably
100%.
Yeah, we saw each other probably.
You're very, very lucky, because I know people who have tried to reach out to their biological family and the family said no. And I can understand why the family said no, because look, I closed the door and like now I'm going to feel a lot of guilt and things. So I understand that perspective. Or when people meet them and it's just like, there's just nothing there. So I think that's really, really great that happened for you. And that I think it's a very moving story. We're going to have one last question. Is America doomed?
I hope not. I mean, I hope not. I'm not kidding when I say I'm really concerned about this, anti-democratic, anti-majoritarian thing because I think it's growing. And I worry that Democratic leaders don't understand the gravity of it, like especially the tenured people.
I agree completely. They're completely out of touch.
They think it's a phase and it's just going to pass. And it's like, well, it's not going to pass.
They thought we got rid of Trump.
Yeah.
So this is all going in the garbage. This is him and his nonsense. We can become adults again. And they are completely missing it.
Yeah, so people don't, as a rule, they don't pay that much attention to like state legislatures. People who are not highly engaged in politics to begin with. And a lot of the really bad stuff is just coming out of state leg.
Can you give me some examples?
The sort of anti-voting rights provisions that people are passing. But even dumber things like the Florida trying to outlaw critical race theory is not going to, that's stupid and it's not going to go anywhere. But when you look at this sort of campaign that they're mounting against even people who are supposedly like free speech advocates or, claim to be 1A advocates are actually applauding like the state outlawing language that people don't want to hear. And there's no kind of reflection about it. There's no introspection on the part of the Republican Party about these things happening because on some level they assume that this is the only way for them to maintain power, is to really have a structure that is anti-majoritarian and protects power for just a handful of people. But it's also one of these things that's been moving so slow. It's this little bit of, frog being boiled in water kind of phenomenon where the people who aren't taking it seriously enough either think they have time to deal with it or they think it's a fringe thing. And I don't think it's a fringe thing.
I think a lot of these people are still in a world where Fox News is the most right-wing source of information in our zeitgeist. And they are so removed from how ideas move in our culture that I wouldn't even know where to begin to sitting them down.
Yeah.
It's a real situation. Okay, we're running out of time.
Right.
What has been your favorite part of this interview?
Well, seeing you. I think the last time I saw you was when your Harvey Pekar book came out. Like, it's been a long time.
You are welcome. Hey everyone, before we go, if you enjoyed this podcast, you might enjoy some of the other podcasts available at gasdigitalnetwork.com. This week we are highlighting the Disgusting Hawk podcast with comedian Jessica Kirson, who I've seen live and is funny. You can find the full catalog of episodes on demand at gasdigitalnetwork.com or catch the latest 15 episodes anywhere you find podcasts. Here is a clip.
Have you ever written out your name on a girl's face?
No, I wish I produced that kind of volume, but I don't. I'm more of like it's an easy cleanup.
It's only 3 letters.
It's true. Maybe if I just finish and drag, do you know what I mean? Keep going back to like an inkwell.
Yes.
Perhaps like that. I will give it a try.
Yes.
I'll try on Christina.
Okay. When you try on Christina, can you videotape it? I love watching things like that.
Oh, God. Are you into videotape?
Yes.
What's your favorite kind of pornography?
Face sitting?
Face sitting?
Yes.
Girl sitting on guy's face?
Yes. I hated my father.
So you feel like every time you're smothering him?
Yes.
Do you scream, Daddy, stop?
Yes. How did you know that, Joseph?
Well, it's Jay. And if my name was Joseph, I'd have to come 7 times to get that name written.
That's very true.
It's a lot. It's a lot
What's
of
your
words.
favorite kind of porn?
Housewives having sex with, are you okay?
Yeah, I'm just
Are you
moving
saying
my
something?
mic. Just
Okay.
have to adjust my mic.
Oh, wow.
Sorry.
I like that.
No, just take it easy.
Is it happening on purpose?
What's your favorite porn?
My favorite porn is
Janelle?
gaggle of black men having sex with housewife while husband watches.
Oh, like watching a woman get pounded by a group of black men, like a gang.
Yeah, a gang bang.
And then the husband watches and says, what is he doing while he watches?
Well, the ones I like is just the ones where they're filming. Sometimes it gets a little, I don't know why, if I'm trying to put myself into the spot of how hot that would be, I don't like the ones when the black guys are insulting the dude. I don't like
Like if
that.
they're on the side going, bet you could do this, motherfucker.
Yeah, I don't want to do that. Then I picture like doing some weird Death Wish vigilante move on all of them.
Right.
Have you ever been involved in a gangbang, Dr.
I
Crane?
have. I've had every hole filled at one time.
One time. Every hole. Are you
Yes.
counting nostrils and ears? Or are
Yes,
you just
every
throwing it down?
hole.
Every hole.
Single hole.
Let's count. That's 2, 4, 5, 6, 7,
Seven.
8, 9, 7?
24.
24/7.
I have holes where you wouldn't even believe where some of my holes are.
What's your favorite hole?
Probably in between my ass and my vagina.
Oh, okay. The third eye.
Yes.
Yes.
I
Yes.
call it the Pamela hole.
That's where your chakra lives.
Yes. That you are very deep.
It's very spiritual. I don't like to talk about it too much because a lot of my friends are lunkheads, like UFC fans and stuff. But I like to mix up. I'm pretty intelligent, I think.
Yeah, I think you are too.
Thank you, doctor.
When you're talking to me, you're kind of like putting on a little thing. Like when like you're taking on my aura, kind of. Are you gay?
A little bit.
Too?
No.
Gay?
No. In fact, I took a lie
Little
detector
gay?
test. Took a lie detector test yesterday. It said I was, in fact, 100% sure that I'm not even bi.
Really?
Yeah. And even that surprised me a little bit.
Have you ever touched a dick?
Yeah.
You have.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us.
It was, it's been several times. Are you okay? Are you choking?
No.
You
I'm
like
just
the story.
thinking. Sometimes when I think, I move my tongue around.
That's understandable. I bounce my knee. It's a little less off-putting, but
So I should bounce my knee instead of push my tongue all over the place?
no. I want you to be comfortable. This is your show. I'm just here as a guest, and I had some questions. You are the foremost sex advice person here at Gas Digital. So
I am.
as a person who's on the network with you, I had some questions I wanted to ask.
Okay, sure. I'm going to let you ask a question in a minute, but when did you touch a dick?
I've touched a dick. I mean, in South Africa, to have our girlfriends at the time agreed to hook up with each other. If their drunken proposal was, but you'd have to touch. If you touch his dick, we'll do that. So,
Of course.
yeah, it was Jim Jeffries. He pulled his dick out, and I just grabbed it because I was like, "Yeah, is that all? Now can we go do this other thing?"
Oh, wow. Did it fit in between your little Thumb, and because he seems small.
You'd think so, right? But it's like now he was Australian, so it was a thick one, a thick softie,
Like a
which
sausage.
we could all hope for, like a sausage, but like when you buy the 12-pack, not like those pre-made like a breakfast links. I'm talking about like a heavy
Like
calabrese,
a chicken apple sausage.
Yes. Now you understand, like a super sod.
Yes, nice.